Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to our webinar series, Embracing Change. We've got Diana Chambers from Switzerland. Thank you, Diana, for making the time out of your busy schedule. And I know Switzerland is beautiful, right? Springs looks like it's just around the corner, I understand. Is that correct?
Gorgeous. I have a wonderful view of the mountains, which is a real privilege. And thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you. So today, Diana, we're going to go right into you being a wealth mentor to many of the large families in Europe and other parts of the world. And you've written this incredible book, which we'll share links to for everyone so that they can, take what we discussed today to the next level. And those who want to continue the conversation, can speak directly to you, which would be beautiful. So let's start with the basics. Let's really go down to the very basics. What is financial emotional intelligence? Like, what does that mean? What does it entail? How do you build it? Is it like a muscle that we do through meditation? Like, how does it work? And what does it even mean?
So at the basic level, I think of financial emotional intelligence as our ability to manage our emotional feelings and responses to money in the face of other people's feelings and responses to wealth. So it's managing the impact of money on us and on our relationships. Okay. And so the way that I look at it, there are several dimensions to it. That's the core of it, is how it's affecting us and how it's changing our relationships. But then there are several skills that would really go with it. One of which is primary, I think it's the first and best line of defense in any challenges about wealth in families, is the ability to talk constructively about money in intimate relationships. And maybe we can come back to that later, because in my experience, that is one of the, challenging elements for people who might find it at best uncomfortable and at worst distasteful to actually try to have meaningful money conversations.
Or taboo, or even taboo.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a family where my grandmother said, "You never talk about money, politics, or religion, dear." So, yes, it can be a pretty challenging topic. So the ability to talk constructively about money in a meaningful way, that's one skill. Another would be to negotiate over money in a relationship, whether that's in a workplace or with a partner or sometimes with a child. And then there's a lot of skills around gifting money. So in the philanthropy space, that would be another place where you would want to be financially, emotionally intelligent in how you do your gifting, but also in resolving conflicts, because money is such a polarizing topic in many settings. And to be able to resolve conflicts over money without having to resort to legal means, I think that's a really important skill.
Okay, so let's okay. So you've given all these different forms. So let's go to the basics, right? So because you said you talk about response to the other person as to how they're relating to money, right? So it's a real relatable skill, right? So it's not just an emotional intelligence. It's emotional intelligence, but this is on money side. So explain a little bit how does that play out? How do we learn that? Or what can we do to improve that? So it means from reactiveness to responsiveness.
Great. I love that shift from reaction to response. And the way to do that, to start with, the only thing that we can manage and control is our own relationship to money. So that's where we have to begin.
Okay.
And so much of my work has been helping my clients do a really deep dive into understanding what it is that has formed and shaped their relationship to money.
Okay.
And I have, over the years, I've used some of the sort of obvious tools like working on money messages, which then take us to another layer of money belief systems. And I can share some of mine. So for example, my father said to me, always be the first to pay for something. That was a money message that I got very powerfully when I was a child. And I would see him act it out. If he was with his friends at a meal, he would always be the first person to offer to pay for the meal, So that was a message that I and my siblings received both in language and in behavior. And often the behavior speaks more powerfully than the language. And another one was that he gave to us was never be in debt. And that's really influenced me during my life, because even when I've been taking on what I would think of as responsible debt, like a mortgage,
Okay.
I have found myself, hardly able to sign the paperwork as I'm sitting there, taking this on, because there's this hugely powerful message of never be in debt. So
even if it makes tax sense, you're still feeling that burden, right? Or that heaviness within. Yeah.
yes. So I've worked with my clients on helping them to find what were their money messages. So how have they been strongly influenced by families or teachers or peers? It can come from many different places. And then you take that underneath to a belief system about money. So we've got the messages. So what does that tell us about our belief system? And when I go deeper into my money messages, they're about control. They're about, if I'm always the first to pay for anything, I'm not going to be indebted, which is then tying in with this money message of never be in debt, So,
okay. Wow.
And I was very, very fortunate once when a dear friend, I was out for dinner with her and one other woman, and I pulled out my credit card to pay. I said, "Oh, let me." And she said, "Diana, I don't like it when you do that, because it distances me." And she pointed to this whole area of how I was then taking control of the dynamic. So she gave me a great gift of pointing that out to me. And now I've had to learn to moderate how I do that in social settings. Yeah. So that's just one example.
Okay, so you've got the messaging, you've got the belief system, and then can we keep peeling the onion, or?
We can keep peeling the onion. And this is the place that I have been going to in the last 5 years. So you referenced my book earlier, and thank you for that. And I wrote that 5 years ago. And since then, I've done another deeper dive, taking off another layer of the onion, as you said. And I've been studying with a teacher called Thomas Hubel, whose extraordinary expertise is in the whole field of the healing and integration of trauma and of collective trauma. And through the work with Thomas, what I have come to understand and believe quite deeply is that all of us have been born into a traumatized world and system. And it appears so normal to us, because that is what our environment is, that we actually can't see and identify that that is our truth. And the way that Thomas would describe it is that trauma ends up being frozen blocks in our nervous system. So flow doesn't happen well within us when we have a traumatized area. And what I have come to appreciate is that the way in which we relate to money is evidence of where we are or are not internally free, where we are or are not in flow. And so we can look on money as an amazing teacher, because it can show us where we're blocked if we choose to look at it. Okay. So that's the extra layer down that I'm now choosing to go with my clients. So for example, I can give you the idea of scarcity. Scarcity is one of the obvious trauma symptoms. Many people would have grown up with some sort of sense of scarcity, whether it was of presence or love or resources or something. And how does that then get expressed in our financial behavior? It could be that we might be greedy and we choose to accumulate or acquire more than we actually need because it's meeting that sense of scarcity. Or it could be that we're hoarders, and once we've got something, we hold on to it because we're afraid that we won't have it any longer. Or it could be that we might fight over resources because we think there aren't enough to go around. So in a family where you see, a fracture playing out, let's say there's a generational transition and the wealth is passing down, and then you see the next generation positioning and potentially fighting over those resources. This is not, normal healthy behavior. This is a reflection of something that is playing out that has not yet been resolved in the family system. So I'm really appreciating this lens of looking through what has shaped us to say, okay, we can look at what shaped us. And now that we have that insight, we can actually heal that and have a different relationship with money that is going to serve us much better as adults.
But that concept you just talked about, right? So it's the wooden spoon versus the golden spoon. And when they say that to me, I say, no, mine's a diamond spoon, right? Because they're being, whatever they're being. So, I mean, the older generation, a lot of them did come to them from that space, right? They started from nothing and built this incredible. I mean, many of the people on the call are, either second gen or third gen, and watched this wealth being amassed or companies built or whatever it is from zero, right? But that patriarch or matriarch who did it is still most of the time dealing with that level of fear of losing it, and also that scarcity mentality, right? So now how do we say, break the pattern, or how do you move through that? What are the conversations, or what are the questions one may want to consider? Of course, they can come to you and have that conversation, but since we're here, what would be the next steps to kind of help move through that?
Right. So you've already taken the first step, which is to become aware of it, to be able to recognize, oh, this is the pattern that was playing out in my G1, my G2, whatever it was. And here I am, G234, and I can see it still passing down. And this is not how I actually want to choose to live. I don't want to live from a place of fear of loss or scarcity or whatever. So first of all, you have to get that awareness. And then I believe that we really need to slow down to unpack it as we're living it. Because if we don't slow down enough, we skim right over the surface and we go straight back into our typical behavior. So if I were working with someone, I might give them a breathing exercise to do. Let's say something happened and they were aware, oh, here I am, I'm in this moment, I've got a choice point here. The awareness is there. So then maybe they do a short inhale and a longer exhale, maybe a count of 4 for an inhale and a count of 6 to exhale, just to slow their system down. Okay. And be present to themselves so that they don't miss the choice point. And part of what needs to happen at that point too is a generosity towards self, not to, beat yourself up and say, here I go again, but to say, that practice used to serve me, it doesn't serve me now. I want to do it differently. I have a choice. Okay. So you can do a certain amount of self-talk to shift that pattern. Then what could come next would be to actually invite somebody else in to help you to really take apart at a very micro level what you're doing in any choice. And I have found it particularly helpful to have a generous, aware presence helping me to do that as I've taken apart some of my own stories and patterns. And I believe that that's where a lot of healing can happen too, because it happens in relationships. It doesn't really happen in isolation. So to have another party there, hearing the story with you, reflecting it back to you, asking you curious questions, helping you to understand, oh, that was how I made the choice. And that was how it suited me before, but it doesn't suit me now. Okay, now I want to choose differently. So those would be a couple of first steps. Another would be to really practice listening to ourselves. And I believe that in our society today, we have really honored our minds and our intellects over our bodies and our emotions. So we immediately go into mentalizing something and saying, oh, well, I did it because of this, 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 and this. You know, but if we slow down enough and listen to our body and our system, it can tell us, help guide us where the right next step is. You know, so it's really a matter of really slowing down, being present, inviting somebody else in to help us to unpack it, and listening to all of our resources, because we've got so much more capacity than just our minds. And so
the gut, the heart, and really the whole self to see what's coming up, what's showing up, and what's resonating, not resonating. So all of us to make that decision or to respond. But the first step you said is to actually stop and create that space between reactiveness and responsiveness, which is present, right? That's
right. And to keep practicing, because we've had a lifetime of doing things a certain way. And then when we become aware and we go, oh, here's this gift now that I can actually choose not to be in that same pattern. But it's not something that we're going to typically be able to just shift in an instant. I mean, it could happen that way, but I know in my own experience that I've had to keep chipping away at it for a while. So it's practice, 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 and it gets easier, and we're quicker to become aware, and we are more able to choose to respond than to react. And the goal ultimately, of course, is that we would just intuitively know, because it would become so, we would become so attuned to our systems and what's playing out that we will know. It's like when we're attuned to our body and we actually know what our body needs to eat. But how many of us actually feed ourselves, you know, food that is inherently bad for us because we're not listening to our system? It's the same thing with money. We want to slow down that we can listen to our system and make the choices that are healthy for us.
Okay, so there's a pattern that's playing out. I usually make the following choice. The family members around me are now kind of used to that pattern. All of a sudden, I take the deep breath, I make a different choice, and I show up and I make that choice and I have resistance. Right? Now you said this is about to relate, right? It's not just about me and making the choice. It's now about how I respond to the pushback. So now what happens then? What's the guidance from that space? Because most probably I will get resistance, right? If I'm trying to break a pattern that's familiar.
Yes, although you might get someone going, thank goodness he changed, you know? It's like, I have been waiting for this. Because that pattern probably wasn't serving the dynamic either.
Okay.
But of course, whoever it is who's on the other side of the dynamic is having to move really fast and go, oh, this just changed. What am I going to do now? This is different than I expected. So that's where we get to this whole question of capacity to communicate.
Okay.
So ideally, what we've done is we've become self-aware.
Okay.
We've changed our reactive pattern, and we're now choosing a new way of being financially in a relationship. And we hopefully also have the capacity to communicate that to the other person or people.
Okay.
So, and this is part of what I teach in terms of communication about money, is to build our own self-awareness and to ask, what am I bringing to the table? Then to reflect on the other people who are going to be in the conversation and say, who are they and what are they bringing to the table? And be sufficiently empathetic and curious about them, that not only have I changed, but that I can communicate with them. You know, I know you're used to me doing A, B, and C, but I want to share with you that I feel whatever it is that I want to say about this new me. And I know this is going to be uncertain for you, and then communicate whatever else it is you want to communicate. So yes, they're going to be taken aback or maybe happily surprised, we don't know. But if you can communicate how you come to that new place, then they can appreciate your process. And it starts creating a lot more space in that dynamic between you and that person. And let's say they're a family member, therefore it starts creating a lot more space in the family system, because suddenly you've got more space as an individual, you've created more space in the relationship. And everything, in a way, you could sort of think of it as everything starts to breathe more deeply. It's like, oh, we can breathe as a family, we can relax. It might be unfamiliar, but there's more space.
Okay, so now you're talking about more space, ability to communicate. But that requires safe space, right? That requires the ability or the willingness to be authentic, right? That it's okay to be real and to really speak my truth and not just, go with the flow because that's just the way it's been, right? So how do you build the confidence of the individual to be able to even take that step? What are the steps to do that? Because if you're going to choose differently, yes, some people will be refreshed, say, wow, I'm so happy that somebody finally said it, right? Because that's what I've been feeling for 15 years or 50 years, right? Depending on the age. So in terms of that, I'm trying to understand if it's the same kind of muscle, right? Are we building a financial intelligence muscle, or is it not the same thing?
We're building our own capacity, our own internal capacity, which will get expressed in all the multiple dimensions of our lives, including our financial emotional intelligence. So that's just one area of expression. So really this is about us being willing to become all of who we can become. Many of us settle for saying, oh, good enough. Here I am, it's good enough. And yes, this isn't great, but we've learned to live with it. Yeah. But instead, I'm inviting and saying, wow, it could become more free and more fulfilling, et cetera, et cetera. But it's work, and it's not always comfortable, easy, etc. But it's ultimately fulfilling for us. And that's why whatever it is that's playing out for us with money, let's be grateful for us, because it can be our teacher. So even if we are experiencing scarcity or envy or fear of loss or something like that, it's an avenue into finding out more about ourselves and becoming freer in our lives. And if one person in a family does it, the family dynamic will start to shift.
So let's take this scarcity versus, okay, so one generation is coming from a space of scarcity, another generation is coming from a space of abundance, right? It's just like we grew up building businesses linearly, and the new generation wants to build exponentially, right, in terms of growth. Now, that leap is not for everyone so simple, right? So are you also working with the matriarchs, patriarchs to help them understand where the next gen is coming from? Or is it more the younger gen that you're helping communicate the other way? Like where do you see, I want, maybe share some stories, right? Where do you see the issues, or where do you see the opportunities, right? That's happening.
I think it has to be, assuming they're open, working with both generations. So I always used to think, when I was doing multi-generational family work in the last couple of decades, I would think, gosh, I really got to help this older generation do some letting go, because they wanted the next expression to reflect their worldview. Yeah. And the environment had changed, and the next generation was a different group of people, and yet they were still holding on. So it often felt like, gosh, the older generation needs to relax its hold, its grip a little bit. So yes, to be able to work with them, to help them to build their confidence in their next generation. Okay. And it takes us back again to this whole question of relationship with money, because, we see so many times where founding generations will set up lots of complicated structures, trusts, whatever, for their next generations, for, with the best possible intentions, but without really understanding all of the dynamics and human implications of them. And one of them, which often surfaces, I'm sure you've seen it a lot, is that there is more concern for protecting the wealth than there is for protecting the family relationships. And there's an inherent sense that you are not as capable of being responsible for this wealth as the founding generation. And it's not a good message to receive if you're on the receiving end of it. So, yes, there is a lot to be done to help the founding generation, the older generations, to understand that their next generations are competent. And how are those next gens actually going to show and express that? Because I believe that if we either generate significant wealth or we're born into significant wealth, then we have a responsibility for owning that and managing that in appropriate ways. That is part of what it means to have been born into this family.
So give us maybe some success stories in terms of the principles some of these families or patriarchs and matriarchs have used to be able to build the confidence of the next gen, to be able to have them prove their capabilities, or of letting go, like a little bit of, so that we can learn, right? That what has worked and maybe what hasn't worked in terms of that space.
Yeah. I'm working with one fabulous family right now where the older generation is really aware that the next generation should be encouraged to express its voice. And what they've done is they have hired someone who's a very capable family business professional to help make sure that the next gen is fully educated and informed. Okay. And then this older generation has basically stepped back and speaks last in meetings. Let's say the older generation and the next gen are in a meeting together, and I'm inviting all of them to respond to a question I might have asked. The older generation always speaks last, unless I call on them, because they know that they don't want to influence, they don't want to carry undue weight. They want to allow their next generation to learn and to find their own path, and they're there should they need them, but they're not going to lead. They're going to be behind as a support.
And how old is the next gen, if you don't mind? Like what are the age groups?
This particular group of next gen is early 30s.
Okay. So at what age should the conversation of money begin, you feel?
Oh, I think the conversation with money has begun from day one.
From birth. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was a wonderful...
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say there was a wonderful New Yorker cartoon that I used to use when I was talking about these subjects. And it's a picture of a woman dressed entirely in Gucci with the Gucci symbols all over her clothing, and the pram with the baby in it. And the pram has Gucci symbols all over it. And then she is pushing the pram going, Gucci, 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 Gucci. And to me, it's just evidence of the fact that we are getting money messages from the day we're born. And it's naive for parents to think that children are not picking up these threads from day one. Now, how conscious you get about them, and when you actually start having over money conversations, I think those get phased in an age appropriate way. But don't discount behavior, because behavior is a massive teacher and influence, and we're behaving from day one.
So let's take my example, right? Let's have some fun. So, we grew up, in comfortable means, and, father started from zero, did very well, etc. And I've sent the boys to boarding school, in Switzerland, not far from you, right? And so, but our values it's all about value versus cost, right? That's what we've been teaching them. And you buy based on value, not based on cost. And some things are expensive and some things are not. Now they've gone to a boarding school where they're surrounded by some of the wealthiest of the wealthiest, right? Now that peer pressure is there. And there's this thing, wait a minute, I'm going to one of the most expensive schools in the world. But at the same time, there's, frugality in certain ways at home, and in certain areas, no. So there's that confusion, right? So have I created from that decision making a confusion within them as to where do I stand? Messaging, that's messaging.
I would say that as long as you're creating an ambiance in the family where they can ask you any questions about this, that the kids will be able to figure it out, because you're going to be guiding them and say, well, I made this conscious choice for the following reasons. And if I missed something, and if your experience of it is different than I intended, please tell me. But my intention was this, and so you're inviting them to actually have that conversation with you, and you're being curious with them as well about what their experience is. So I've always liked the action reflection model of learning. And so hypothetically, here are your boys at this boarding school in Switzerland.
They're not.
They're close by. So they come home in a holiday, half-term holidays, whatever it happens to be, and you slow down enough to ask them questions about their experience at school in this last term. And you're asking them questions that could go to the heart of, financial topics like exclusion and privilege and things like that. So if you take that time when they come home, you're going to elicit any topics that they may be a little confused about. It's like, we don't do this. I mean, all these peers at school are all flying off to do XYZ over the holidays. And that's not how we spend our holidays. How does this all stack up? Well, let's ask Dad. Or Dad actually says, where have all your peers gone for the holidays? And then you say why we're doing what we're doing. So you use it as an opportunity to teach. And I think we miss too many teachable moments. Like we send our kids off for, extracurricular experiences and building their resumes and doing all that sort of thing. But do we take the time when they come back from that experience to actually say, so what did you learn? And you're not just talking about the hands-on learning. What did they learn about themselves? What did they learn about being with other people? What did they learn about the nature of the world?
Yeah. So, because we've been talking about money with the boys since they're 7, 8, 9 years old, right? Even in terms of inheritance, right? How should the inheritance be broken up? I think they were 11 and 13, right? Like real conversations with percentages and the whole 9 yards. And a lot of pushback from other parents saying, what are you doing, right? How can they even know on an annual basis where we stand, right? And it's fine. A good year is a good year, and not so good year is not so good year, right? And that way they kind of maybe gauge themselves into their spending habits or whatever it is, right? But so that's why I'm asking about the age, because a lot of people think that starting at 7 and 9 and 11 and 13 is too much information, right?
Okay, so I think, we can have principles about which age we would actually reveal the numbers. But as you know from having children and seeing other children, there's different levels of maturity at different ages. So you can have a very immature 20-year-old, or you can have a massively mature 20-year-old. And so you can give a lot more information to the one who's mature and able to receive it. So that would go back to your parenting skills and capacity, that you had actually engendered that capacity in the children earlier so that they could hear and receive it, and it didn't knock them off kilter. Yeah. So that's why I hesitate to say, oh, well, you do this at this age, because it all depends on the parents' capacity to communicate, on the ability that they've already built within the kids to receive information and then to process it. So I think it's fantastic that you've already been able to do that with your family. Really fabulous.
So let's go to another conversation, right? So we always say that, the ability to learn how to fish versus fish, right? When we're talking about wealth, right? So in your experience with the families you're working with, right? We always say that the new gen, the whole purpose of education and exposure and experience, et cetera, is to teach you to learn how to fish. But you don't necessarily need to fish because we've taught you how to fish. Now go fish, right? While the older generation, right, whoever it is, requires a fish because of sustainability. Now, of course, these are people that have way beyond their needs. So what are the most successful people or families that you feel, how are they handling that in terms of, the business, which is the ability to fish, or new business versus the fish, and then dealing with entitlement at the same time, right? There's that fine line. So maybe
it's a really important topic. And I have often said when I've worked with families that one of the most significant gifts you can give to your children is the knowledge that they can be financially self-sustaining, and that they know how to take care of themselves financially, because you don't want to have encouraged children to be either entitled or dependent, feeling like they don't have that ability. And just to wrap that back to our earlier part of our conversation, those also, entitlement and dependency, are evidence of a sense of lack of capacity. We're dependent on somebody else to do this for us, which takes us back to this whole underlying question of what shaped us this way in the first place. So if the parents are really clear about wanting to make sure that the kids feel that they have self-efficacy, they're resilient, they've got what I would think of as a G1 mindset, we're generators, we're not just consumers, we're creating, then that's a massive gift to give to your children. Because apart from anything else, you don't know if those resources will be sustained for whatever reason. I mean, that's not all in your hands. So to have children and family members who are confident that they can thrive in the world without those added resources, it's fantastic. And then those added resources are, as you could say, the topping on the cake. It's like,
they're still available. They're not given away. So the big families are still passing it down and not saying, we're just going to give it away. What are they doing? Are they still passing this capacity to the children? I mean, they've built their own capacity. Do they really need their wealth?
Takes us back to what is our particular path? So for example, some people might choose to give away all of their resources. And that might be done in a very appropriate and altruistic and generous way. But other people, when they give away, do it because they're afraid of the impact that it's going to have on themselves or on somebody else. And so it's not a totally, it could have some reactionary elements to it as opposed to pure gift. So I don't think you can say that it's always a certain way. It depends on the individual and the energy behind what they're doing and whether they're really free. So I'll give a little example of, this is not a generational shift, but I had one young client who was coming into the first round of trust funds. This is a long time ago. And the client's parents thought that she was going to spend the resources she was about to receive on, first of all, buying a new horse, because this was her.
Okay, her passion.
It was her pleasure. It was not even her profession, but they thought that this was what she was going to do. So I had a conversation with her and very rapidly learned that she wanted nothing to do with the money. She thought money was bad. She thought money damaged relationships. And her intention was to give the entire inheritance away.
Okay.
So this was so counter to what her parents thought, but then they weren't talking about it. They hadn't had that conversation with her. And I was having that conversation with her and had to unpack, well, why do you think money is so damaging?
Yeah.
You know, and why would you not want this money to be in your life or in your bank account? Why, how is this going to actually hurt you? You know, so we had to go through a whole different conversation and experience to free that up. But my point is that just because people give money away doesn't mean that it's given freely or from a responsive place.
Okay. So going back to that, so we always, I mean, for us, when we're, we do what we do at Genetic Care, we always look at the physical as a symptom, but the actual underlying issue is something very different. So now, when you say that to me, the behavior or the relationship to money actually is sourced from a familial pattern or familial experience. So how are you going into that space? Like, I mean, I know you touched on it, but how do you unpack that?
Yeah. So just to say, I think it's more than just a familial source, okay, because I think we now know that there's all this research on passing down through multi-generations, epigenetically, ways of being and patterns of behavior. So we know that that's a reality long, over a long chain within a family. It's not just up one generation or two, it's multi-generations. But also we're born into our societies and cultures, which are going to significantly influence us. So it's very complex for a person to be able to unpack all of those influences and to use, as you were talking about the body, to say, okay, here are these symptoms. Yeah. So what we do with money is a symptom. Exactly. What is it a symptom of? How can we use this to actually find out more about ourselves and then make a choice? And what I have learned is that this is absolutely a lifelong journey. So I've been trying to be conscious about my relationship with money way back from in my 20s. And I'm still getting hit over the head by major insights that I simply hadn't been ready to appreciate and learn about myself. And the way that I experience it, Feisal, is that the more resources we bring to bear on ourselves, the more likely we are to have some opening, some experience, some quantum leap in terms of our insight and capacity. Because if we just have one thing coming into us, like let's say looking at our relationship with money, it can be a pretty slow journey to like slowly unpack that. But if we're looking at our health, and if we're looking at our emotions, and if we're looking also at our money, and if we're looking in several ways and bringing different resources together, there's much more likelihood of insight and shift happening.
Yeah, because that's why I'm asking is like for us, we do the first is the audit, right? Which will be the financial audit from your perspective. Then we look at the behavior, what's driving the behavior. Then we look at the thoughts and emotions. Then we look at the beliefs and patterns. Then we look at the story driving. And then we look at the alignment, right? Between values, talents, and aspirations. And then we look at the genomics and epigenetics. So, and then of course, the capacity of the gut and the brain, where you talked about really that balance. So, all of this then gives you the picture, but we've never looked at it, consider it from a wealth perspective. We looked at it from a health and well-being perspective, and wealth is part of the system, right? It is an element of all of this. So I'm just trying to understand if you're doing, if the clients are going through all this, a number of dimensions to be able to unpack or unravel or discover right?
Yeah.
That space, which I think you're alluding to, right?
Well, I think your model's fabulous. I love it that you have that comprehensive, spectrum that you're encouraging people to engage with, all those multiple pieces. And in my experience, because I've been coming from the financial space and looking at the impact of money, that I have done my best to bring those pieces together for my clients when I felt, one, that they were ready, and two, that it was apparent that this was something else that they might want to look at, whether it was to do with their physical health and well-being or whatever it might have been. So in my own way, I've been trying to offer a more comprehensive package, but I don't have that in the same way that you do. And I think it's fabulous that you do. And I believe that if we see any of the expressions that are playing out in our lives as symptoms, it can take us back into that holistic look at, well, who are we and why are we shaped like this? I don't know if you know that a few years ago, Oprah Winfrey, when she was doing some work with kids and education, she came up with this phrase, and she said, don't ask what's wrong with that kid, ask what happened to this kid. And she's got a book that's coming out, I think, this week on this whole same topic, to do with childhood trauma and why some kids don't function well in school and why some are doing fine. But I think that it's the same thing for us. It's not what's wrong with you. It's what happened to you. And how can you then bring healing in whatever way you need it in your system.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's go to that for a second, right? So when we see behavior of children, right? And to us, it's an expression of a healing that they're screaming to happen at the familial level and mainly at the parental level. So are you seeing that as well when it comes to the financial behavior, that actually the financial behavior is an expression of a real asking, please do the work you need to do as parents, because I'm going to keep doing this until you listen? Or because I would assume that might be part of it. Like, we're seeing it in terms of alcohol, in terms of drugs, in terms of smoking, in terms of, sexual habits. So I'm assuming money is one of them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And part of the challenge, of course, as you know from the work you're doing, is that the parents of the children have not necessarily been prepared to be parents in this way. And they are struggling with those same issues, addictions, whatever it happens to be themselves. And they too are using the money in ways that is relieving them of whatever is uncomfortable internally, So we see kids mirroring their parents. And you can't have a parent who says, well, don't do that, if the parent's still doing it. It's like that story about Gandhi, who a woman was taking her child to him and asking him to tell the child not to eat sugar. And the woman had to go back multiple times before finally Gandhi told the child not to eat sugar. And it turned out Gandhi had been eating sugar. So he couldn't actually say it until the time at which he could say it with authenticity. Yes. And the same would be true of the parenting that we're doing of our children in all realms. If we're not authentic ourselves, we can't teach this to them.
Yeah, but a lot of the parents that are on the call right now will say we are not making those choices in terms of the elements we spoke to, but then there's other elements that they're making. And I like the word you said, in all realms, right? So some will just sit back and go, no, but I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do all those things. But that's not it, right? It's also the other, the thoughts, the emotions, the beliefs, the patterns, the drivers, right? All of that they may be expressing differently.
Right. It doesn't necessarily have to be some overt physical substance expression. It could be that, we compare and contrast ourselves with others, which I think is a very invidious place to be, because we're always undermining ourselves. Or we could be feeling envious of others, or we could be, any variety of things in which we are not fully at ease with our relationship to money.
I want to urge everyone to please ask questions. We've got another 10 minutes, and I know that Diane and I can continue on, and there's some people I know who are advising a lot of the families that I see on the call. It would be beautiful for you to participate and ask the questions to challenge Diane a little bit from the experiences you've seen. So now what have we not touched on, Diana, that you'd love to share that we haven't looked at, maybe from your book, from your experience, from just in general?
I think one thing that's really important, Feisal, to just say is that we have focused here solely, essentially, on financial emotional intelligence. And I think it's very important to get it in balance with what I think of as financial cognitive intelligence. And so financial cognitive intelligence, from my perspective, is all the nuts and bolts of money. How do you, invest appropriately? Where's the money coming from and going to? Budgeting, all of those core financial skills. I don't discount those at all. I think they're very important. And I think the two need to run in parallel and complement each other. But I just want to say that because I don't focus so much on the cognitive skills. I can teach some of those basics, but I think there are others who are better prepared to do that. But I focus on the emotional side because it's not what we've been taught. Okay. We get taught the other skills pretty readily in multiple settings, and they're skills that are very respected. Okay. But this financial emotional intelligence, it's not easy to come by.
Okay, so the cognitive side there is just are there specific companies or people that you'd recommend, or is it just find your way to provide the education to the families so that the children or the next gen have that capability, right, of the cognitive side, because those are just the basics, right? You're talking about the basics, accounting.
Right. Well, some families are going to, have their family offices and their internal people who can certainly provide that education for the next gens. I think part of the issue is making sure that whoever you put to do that actually is a good teacher. So I've seen some families who they've said, oh, we'll get our investment advisor to teach, these things on asset classes. And you put the investment advisor in front of the kids and they just miss, it's like, no, they're not communicating in the same way. And this investment advisor has never been a teacher. So I think we just have to be careful that we screen first, because what we want to make sure is that the next gens are enjoying the process of learning, so that they can see the benefit and they want to learn and they're hungry for more. So you want every educational opportunity to be a big success. So
we'll challenge Mark, who's actually on the call as well right now and going to be speaking next week from, he's the deputy CEO of Stone Age Fleming. So we'll challenge him on how much fun the next gen is having when they have their various events every year and they call in and to educate, like you said, on, it's not just that they do the values, they do the both sides of it. We have a question here. In your opinion, has the COVID pandemic changed things in regard to the relationship with money? It's a pretty broad question, but
yeah, I'm wondering where to target that.
Maybe I guess experiences that shifted people or pushed people to make choices that maybe pre-pandemic they weren't considering. I don't know.
I am experiencing with some of my clients that it has caused, certainly around their philanthropy, a much deeper look at systemic issues, systemic equity issues, like, is access to healthcare readily available across, different racial groups or whatever, and is there a gap in there that they might want to consider addressing or funding? So I've certainly seen that it's had an influence on how my clients are thinking about their philanthropy. I can say for myself, it's also influenced me to think about the fact that so much of what we have in life is abundant and free. And we often move too fast to appreciate it. So I'm very fortunate. I live up in the mountains. It's glorious. I can go for long walks and hikes in nature every day. And I don't have to pay to do that. So it's given me a different appreciation of my resources. What is actually a resource?
But we've seen from our experience, a lot of families, and I'm sure Mark will share, that are, because of, their age and now mortality, having those conversations. And as a result, the letting go, or the conversation about wealth, has been accelerated. And that's what we've seen. And I'm sure Mark will share some stories next week when he's on. So we've got here, any thoughts about money and spirituality, different from money and philanthropy?
Yes, lots of thoughts about money and spirituality, because it's that whole journey, my own spiritual journey, that has caused me to start unpacking these pieces. And the great faith traditions tell us a lot about a right relationship to money, a healthy relationship to money. And you'll get the same messages repeated across the traditions. So the question is, how do we then apply? How do we then apply that in our own lives? It's all very well to know certain things, but then how do we actually live them? So that takes us back to a very broad, deep spiritual journey, and using all the tools of whatever practice we choose to engage with to build our own capacity to be authentic across what we think and believe, how we live, how we express ourselves, so that we are as coherent as we might be.
So you talk, so there's a consistency, right, across. So like you said, the behavior expressing the value systems. And so we've got one more question. Is there an example of a family that one can look at for inspiration on how they're being healthy in the wider sense? What I mean is, what does it look like to do this work? What's the end result, and what does it look like? It's obviously from a money perspective, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to sort of name any families. I mean, I see, like, I have one client family where one of the older generation is just coming into just her power and her freedom. And I feel like she's sort of like growing in a hothouse, it's like exploding, and it's having a massive influence down through the generations. So yes, you can see it shift and change for sure. And there is an outcome. I'm not going to point, I'm sorry, to an example and say, yes, here's a perfect example, because everything's so customized and everything's so individual, and these are very personal choices that people are making. And what we see on the outside could be driven by very different motivations, so for the same behavior may be driven very differently in different people. So I'm not going to generalize.
So what about the differences between men and women when it comes to money? Are you still seeing? I mean, when you said your dad said pay first, it was quite, from our generation, to say that to a girl or a woman at that time is pretty bold, right? Mm-hmm. Because at that time, if you went on a date and you said, you took out your credit card, I don't know how well that must have landed, but
not very well, I can tell you. So I've actually worked in depth with women and have done this work over about 15 years, especially with a focus on women coming into wealth suddenly through divorce, death, or inheritance, sometimes sale of a successful business as well. And there used to be stereotypes that you would hold for women, like women didn't like to say how much they were worth because they didn't want it to create divisions in their relationships, so that they would be very careful to protect the relationships more than separating themselves out through different levels of wealth. There's so much work going on right now in different financial institutions about raising up the capacity of women to become full financial decision makers in their relationships and those sorts of things. I still do think that women tend not to flex their financial muscles in the same way as men. But I hope to be one of the voices that encourages that.
Okay, perfect.
The shift. But yeah, I do think there's a difference.
Okay, we're out of time, but we're still going to take the last question. So how do you think we can help our next generation to develop a more conscious leadership where focus is directed towards sensing, learning, deciding, and acting authentically and with integrity? Obviously from money, I would say. So conscious leadership, what do you...
Right. So that I believe that anyone who exercises their gifts is becoming a leader in that space. Okay. So it's not just the person who's at the top of the hierarchy who's the leader. It's anyone who, wherever they are in the system, is expressing themselves fully and hopefully authentically, that they are leading in that issue for the family. So that would then point us back to say, how do we help our family members to be as whole, healthy, as they possibly can be, with a growth mindset, staying curious, and knowing that this is a lifelong journey and being excited about being on that. So, I think it's seeing everyone as a leader when they are expressing themselves fully.
So we're at the end of our session. Thank you, Diana. Last sharing words, things that maybe they should reflect on before they receive the video and some of the link to your book, etc. Any last sharings that you'd like to do?
I think I would just like to invite everybody to be curious about themselves.
Okay.
Who am I? What shaped me? And where does this come from? This thing that I take for granted in my life.
Okay.
And then to apply that same curiosity to others.
I love that. So we're gonna put that, when we share the video, we're gonna put those questions with it, so that we can invite them to really think through that. Okay.
Great.
So Diana, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Feisal.
For the time from your busy schedule.
So
it was really beautiful. I'm sure everybody really enjoyed it. And like I said, we'll do the sharings and hope to see you soon in Switzerland at some point. Don't know when, but hopefully soon. So enjoy the weather. Thank you, everyone. We have Mark McMullen coming in next week from Stone Age Plumbing. The Deputy CEO is going to talk about the role of the family office in the evolution of families. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Dan, again. And see you all next week. Thank you.